So Chad Harbach is from Racine, Wisconsin. He studied at Harvard. He earned an MFA in creative writing from the University of Virginia. He's the co-founder and co-editor of N+1 magazine, and he's the author of The Art of Fielding, which exploded onto the literary scene in 2011 after a ferocious bidding war, and the rest is kind of publishing history. So this is The Art of Fielding. I don't know if you've seen this yet. I'm sure lots of you have read it. But it's a wonderful book, a fabulous novel. And one of the reviews that came out about The Art of Fielding very close to its publication said that the book was a novel about baseball in the same way that Moby Dick is a book about whale. So, despite that, however, it is a novel that has baseball at its core.
Moby Dick is, there's a lot of whaling in Moby Dick. Yeah.
So taking that as our starting point, I would like, before we dispense with baseball as being the central conceit of the novel, although it plays a huge role, I would like to set the scene a little bit. Can we chat a little bit about baseball in the popular American imagination and why it's such a big deal?
Yeah, should I start?
Please do.
I mean, I think, I think there's probably a couple of questions there. Because for one thing, baseball looms very large in the sort of American literary imagination, and it also kind of looms large in the American imagination more generally. And I think, the latter, I think, has a lot to do with the fact that baseball and American history have been really sort of contiguous in a lot of ways. Since just before, since a couple decades before the American Civil War, baseball has been a really central part of American culture, and I think there are a lot of ways in which you can sort of trace American history through the history of baseball. And people have done this time and time again in Ken Burns's documentary about baseball, and so for instance, like the sort of racial history of America, often gets discussed through baseball, through the period in the early 20th century when there were segregated leagues. There was the Negro leagues, and there were the major leagues, and then finally, in the late 1940s, these things became integrated. So there's this way in which American history has always been kind of bound up with baseball, and you can talk about these things in terms of one another. In a way that doesn't apply for other sports, right? Because baseball has been around a lot longer than football or basketball in American culture. Yeah, absolutely. There's probably the best baseball book is a sort of an oral history of the early years called The Glory of Their Times, and this intrepid historian went around and interviewed a lot of the players from the 1890s and the early 1900s and the teens, and you just get this amazing sort of picture of America and the kind of eccentricity of these ball players in America, in a time before mass media sort of homogenized people's behaviors in a certain way, and you can't do that with other sports because they don't go back that far.
Right. But there's this amazing kind of binding up of baseball with this really seemingly very American sort of emotion. Like, I have to confess, we did watch in my house a few clips from Field of Dreams to prepare for this interview. Kevin Costner has made 5 baseball movies. But there's this amazing, I found this quote as well from a book, now his name, Joe Bouton, is that right? Do you know? Let me just find my notes. Ball 4 by Jim Bouton.
Oh, Jim Bouton,
He says, you spend a good piece of your life gripping a baseball, and in the end, it turns out that it was the other way around all the time. I think there's something about the way that baseball just seems to capture this really kind of epic sense of emotion about a lot of American popular culture. Do you agree with that?
Yeah.
Good. So there's also another one, actually, when you mentioned about the literary relationship, books and baseball. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah, I mean, there's I forget who said it, but there's someone said, about the sort of relationship between sports and American writing, that the smaller the ball, the better the writing. And the idea was that there's been quite a number of good writers about golf, for one thing, and about baseball, and then the bigger the ball gets, I guess I don't know, the worse the writing. But I think there's but it's a fairly slow moving game. It's a fairly sort of pacific game, and so I think it's a game which opens up these kind of gaps and opportunities for kind of reflection and thought, that in a way that has been very appealing to writers over the years.
There's another lovely quote from the sports writer Joe Posnanski. He says, "To me, baseball feels like the most literary of American sports. I think that's largely because of the pace. It's a fairly slow-moving game. There's a pastoral sense to it. It's outdoors. It starts in the spring. It ends in the fall. It feels like a rebirth every year. There's just this wonderful feeling about it, which is why people have written very poetic things about it."
Yeah, you know way more about this than I do.
So, this is the setting. I think that the kind of the epic nature of baseball and the amount of emotion and the kind of shorthand that gives you as a reader, I think it's really important for where we go in the novel. But to give you a bit more specifics, our lead character is Henry Scrimshanter, and he comes from a very small, unassuming town in the Midwest. And he gets picked up by a key player in the college baseball team, and then his dreams begin from here. He gets taken off to Westish College, and the novel plays out from there as he finds himself in this new setting, this new scenario, and all the drama begins to unfold. Can you tell us why college and why the campus was such a fruitful setting for the kind of identity story that begins to play out?
Why the campus? Yeah, well, I mean, for a few reasons. I mean, for one thing, I mean, the novel kind of began with because baseball really was kind of the first germ of the novel, and there's a sort of crisis of self-doubt that Henry goes through in the novel that is something that has happened to some really good baseball players, and that was kind of the first germ of the book. And so, I knew from the start that baseball was going to be at the heart of the book. So in a way, I sort of had two choices. I could either set the book on a college campus and make him a very good college player, or I could set it in the professional leagues. Now I had been to college, but I had not played professional baseball. So I felt that to do it on a campus was something that I could write in a much deeper sort of way. But I do think that the campus setting is really kind of crucial to the whole kind of feel of the book. And I think what you find, what I'm kind of struck by in contemporary American culture is the way that these colleges become a very kind of strange and kind of walled off part of people's lives, where it's almost the kind of utopian impulse in American society gets kind of channeled into the colleges, and a lot of people that you go to college and it becomes this really immersive thing, and people sort of fall in love with their colleges and fall in love with their lives there, and it's really quite nice in so many ways, but then you get toward the end of it and you realize that they're going to kick you out.
Right.
And that you're about to be sort of ejected into this world that is quite different and maybe crueler in a lot of ways. And I think the book is about that in many ways. You have this kind of series of characters at Westish College who are contemplating having to leave, and this is a sort of critical moment in their lives. Yeah.
There's been, I mean, we had Jeffrey Eugenides here on Tuesday night talking about the marriage plot, and that and quite a few other books, I think, in the last couple of years have focused on that exact same setting and that anxiety and that tension of what happens, particularly for young men. I think it's a really interesting sort of fruitful time for all of that anxiety and identity crisis to all sort of come together. But for you personally, Chad, your experience, you went to Harvard, and from what I understand, that was not the usual academic path from somebody from your upbringing, from your school, all of that sort of thing. How dislocating was it for you to be plucked from the Midwest and then into this rarefied academic setting?
Oh yeah, it was quite terrifying. I mean, like you said, I grew up in a town called Racine, Wisconsin, a very modest, middle-class industrial town, and no one there really hardly knew what Harvard was. I hardly knew. Everyone in my family and everyone I went to school with all just went to a college in Wisconsin. In my mind, the world was kind of divided up into, there were these colleges inside Wisconsin and nearby, and then there was Harvard,
right?
Right, which was this kind of magical place that you saw in the movies, and was this sort of academic, sort of nirvana. It's very strange to think back on, because I just sort of applied to it out of the blue and got in and had very little idea what that meant, and nobody I knew had any idea. I would tell people in Racine that I was going to Harvard, that I went to Harvard, and they would say, "Oh, you're a lawyer," and I would say, "Well, I'm not exactly a lawyer," because no one had much of a conception of this, and so I got there, and it was truly. It was truly strange, and I found myself among a group of classmates who were so much more sophisticated and worldly than I was, who had such better secondary educations than I had, who were largely from a different social class than I was, and at the time I didn't even know that social class existed. And so I didn't even have a sort of language to put to this. So I've kind of found myself in the position that Henry finds himself early in the book, when he arrives at Westish and just is completely overwhelmed by everything he sees.
Well, as soon as he gets to college, he is sort of like a deer in the headlights, isn't he? He kind of buries himself in his room. He waits for this one person at the school he knows to contact him, and in the meantime, he tries to live a very kind of sort of quiet existence, just sort of staying out of the way. But I really loved how articulate a lot of the characters were, and I read somewhere that you had found that when you went to college, it was the first time you discovered that you could be both smart and athletic, and I think that's a really interesting idea. It's like I can relate to that, actually. I'm from rural Scotland, and until you move to the city, those two things generally don't don't match up. But the characters in the novel have this amazing facility with language, apart from Henry, and they quote all kinds of Greek mythology, and they instantly get literary references left, right, and centre. And I wondered how much, as you were writing it, how much that was sort of a true experience that you had found when you went to Harvard and you met these people, or whether it was something that you felt you could have a bit of poetic license and a bit of fun with, because it's not your average kind of it's not the average mashup, really.
Yeah, well, I mean, it's certainly not universal, and it's certainly not the case that every college athlete, has these kind of, literary or intellectual interests. But I do think it happens all the time, And for me, I think I kind of had the experience of, when I was quite young, I just sort of read and wrote incessantly, and then I reached adolescence, and I also played sports from from the time I could sort of stand up, but then I reached adolescence, and none of my friends read books. I didn't exist within any sort of very literary community at all. So I sort of set that whole kind of part of my personality aside and just sort of focused myself on, playing baseball and playing basketball, throughout junior high school and high school, because that was the way, because I loved it for one thing, but it was the way to fit in and make friends and, and impress girls and all, and all these sorts of things. So when I got to Harvard and I met, it made an impression on me, to make friends with some of these guys who were such, who were these big dudes and quite good athletes and quite serious about it, but also quite scholarly. And and so these were two kind of interests of mine that I had never really seen combined in the same humans before. So I think that, so ultimately, obviously, that had some kind of influence on the book.
Is there any one character in the book that you identify most strongly with, or are you a kind of mix of them?
Yeah, I think over the course of writing, my allegiances would shift from time to time, and I would find myself, really enjoying writing a certain character at certain points. But in the end, I think all the five main characters kind of, they're sort of, in some ways, they're less drawn from people I know than they are just kind of disparate aspects of my own personality, which you get to sort of, so it's this kind of play acting where you get to take a certain part of yourself and spin it out into an entire person.
Yeah. Would you like to read us a little passage so the audience can get a feel for what the art of fielding sounds like?
Yeah, sure. That Thanksgiving was Henry's first holiday away from home. He spent it at the dining hall, working his new job as a dishwasher. Chef Spiridakis, the head of dining services, was a tough boss, always marching around inspecting your work. But the job paid more than Henry had ever made at the Piggly Wiggly in Langton. He worked the lunch and dinner shifts, and afterward, Chef Spiridakis gave him a sliced turkey breast to take back to Owen's mini-fridge. Henry felt a surge of homesick joy when he heard his parents' voices on the phone that night, his mom in the kitchen, his dad lying on his back in the family room with the TV on mute, ashtray by his side, half-heartedly doing the stretches he was supposed to do for his back. In Henry's mind, he could see his dad rolling his bent knees slowly from side to side. His pants rode up to his shins. His socks were white. Imagining the whiteness of those socks, the terrible clarity with which he could imagine it, brought a tear to Henry's eye. Henry! His mother's voice wasn't Thanksgiving cheery, as he'd expected. It was chagrined, ominous, odd. Your sister told us that Owen... Henry wiped away the tear. He should have known that Sophie would spill the beans. Sophie always spilled the beans. She was as keen to get a rise out of people, especially their parents, as Henry was to placate them. Is gay. His mom let the word hang there. His dad sneezed. Henry waited. Your father and I are wondering why you didn't tell us. Owen's a good roommate, Henry said. He's nice. I'm not saying gay people aren't nice. I'm saying, is this the best environment for you, honey? I mean, you share a bedroom. You share a bathroom. Doesn't it make you uncomfortable? I sure hope so, said his dad. Henry's heart fell. Would they make him come home? He didn't want to go home. His total failure so far, to make friends, to get good grades, or even to find Mike Schwartz, made him more loath to go home than if he were having, like everybody around him seemed to be having, the world's most wonderful time. Would they put you in a room with a girl, his mom asked? At your age? Never. Never in a million years. So why would they do this? It makes no sense to me. If there was a flaw in his mom's logic, Henry couldn't find it. Would his parents make him switch rooms? That would be horrible, worse than embarrassing. To go to the housing office and request a new room assignment. The housing people would know instantly why he was asking, because Owen was the best possible roommate, neat and kind, and rarely even home. The only roommate who'd want to be rid of Owen was a roommate who hated gay people. This was a real college, an enlightened place. You could get in trouble for hating people here, or so Henry suspected. He didn't want to get into trouble, and he didn't want a new roommate. His mom cleared her throat in preparation for a further revelation. We hear he's been buying you clothes. 2 weeks prior, on Saturday morning, Henry had been playing Tetris when Owen and Jason walked in. Owen, calm and chipper as always, Jason sleepy-eyed and carrying a big paper cup of coffee. Henry closed the Tetris window, opened the website for his physics class. "Hi guys," he said. "What's up?" "We're going shopping," said Owen. "Oh, cool, have fun." The "we" is inclusive. "Please put on your shoes." "Oh, that's okay," Henry said. "I'm not much of a shopper." "But you're not a master of litotes," Jason said. Litotes. Henry repeated it to himself so that he could look it up later. "When we get back," Jason said, "I'm burning those jeans." "What's wrong with these jeans?" Henry looked down at his legs. It wasn't a rhetorical question. There was clearly something wrong with his jeans. He'd realized as much since arriving at Westish, just as he'd realized there was something wrong with his shoes, his hair, his backpack, and everything else. But he didn't know quite what it was. The way the Eskimos had 100 words for snow, he had only one for jeans. They drove in Jason's car to a mall in Door County. Henry went into dressing rooms and emerged for inspection, over and over. "There," Owen said, "finally." "These?" Henry tugged at the pockets, tugged at the crotch. "I think these are kind of tight." "They'll loosen up," Jason said, "and if not, so much the better." By the time they'd finished, Owen had said "there, finally" to 2 pairs of jeans, 2 shirts, and 2 sweaters. It was a modest stack, but Henry added up the price tags in his mind, and it was more than he had in the bank. "Do I really need 2?" he said. "One's a good start." "2," said Jason. Henry frowned down at the clothes. "Oh." Owen slapped himself on the forehead. "Did I forget to mention? I have a gift card for this establishment, and I have to use it right away, lest it expire." He reached for the clothes in Henry's hand. "Here." "But it's yours," Henry protested. "You should spend it on yourself." "Certainly not," Owen said. "I would never shop here." He pried the stack from Henry's hands, looked at Jason. "You guys wait outside." So now Henry had 2 pairs of jeans that had loosened up slightly, but still felt way too tight. As he sat by himself in the dining hall, watching his classmates walk by, he noticed that they looked quite a bit like other people's jeans. Progress, he thought. I'm making progress. "Is that true," his dad said now? "You got this guy buying you clothes?" Henry tried to think of a not untrue response. "We went to the mall." "Why is he buying you clothes?" His mom's voice rose again. "I doubt if he buys Mike Schwartz clothes," Henry's dad said. "I doubt that very much." I think he wants me to fit in." Fit into what is maybe a question worth asking. Honey, just because people have more money than you doesn't mean you have to conform to their ideas about fitting in. You have to be your own person. Are we understood? "I guess so." "Good. I want you to tell Owen thank you very much, but you cannot, under any circumstances, accept his gifts. You're not poor, and you don't have to accept charity from strangers." "He's not a stranger, and I already wore them. He can't take them back." "Then he can wear them himself." He's taller than me." "Then he can donate them to someone in need. I don't want to discuss this anymore, Henry. Are we understood?" Henry didn't want to discuss it anymore either. It dawned on him, as it hadn't before, he was dense, he was slow, that his parents were 500 miles away. They could make him come home, They could refuse to pay the portion of his tuition they'd agreed to pay, but they couldn't see his genes. Understood, he said.
Thank you. There's something, I think that is a great passage. It's so emblematic of the empathy that you sort of have for Henry. You feel so sorry for him because he is so naive. He just really has been thrust out into the world with no clue. But what I like about it too is that I think a lot of the humour comes from this kind of, it's almost cartoonish, the perspective, because some things loom impossibly large and things that we might find a little trivial are right up there with some of the much bigger existential or much more political questions in the novel. And I think it reminded me of things like Fortress of Solitude, or those novels that deal with that kind of same experience of coming out of adolescence and just the world being a big, terrifying place.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know. I mean, you just put it better than I could.
But let's talk a little bit about Owen, because he is such an interesting character. And one of the things I found very refreshing about the portrayal of him is that he's so unstereotypical. You could have written the gay character in so many ways that would not have made him as interesting or as real as Owen is. And he's so unapologetic, which is just lovely for a reader. And I think that the novel deals in the same way with racial identity, with a few other things that would be laboriously politicized in another less skillful set of hands. How did you come to the character of Owen, and was there ever any kind of question of how you would write him?
Yeah, well, I think certain things about Owen were tricky, but in the main, I think his personality was pretty much intact from very early on. You know, and in a way, he's just the sort of polar opposite of Henry, right? You know, because Henry is so naive and so unformed, and you know, can really sort of only think of life through the lens of playing baseball, you know, and when he steps a little bit outside of that, he's totally lost. You know, whereas Owen is one of these people. I've met these people. I don't quite understand them, but who are sort of fully formed at a very early age, you know, and so and I think it makes these people sort of quite charismatic in a way, because they have a self-possession that everyone else kind of wishes that they had. And so I think, you know, in some ways, Owen's personality kind of, it sort of sets up the kind of, in terms of the way that gayness and race are treated in the novel. You know, these things, in some ways, these things are really shaped by Owen's personality, because he's a person who can kind of redraw the boundaries for himself, you know, and he can kind of he's able to sort of set the terms of the debate, right. You know, so he kind of shows up on the first day of baseball tryouts and kind of says, "Look, I'm the gay guy who's trying out for the team. Is everyone okay with that?" and he's able to do that in such a way that everyone's like, "Yeah, I guess we're okay with that." Right. And you know, so it's, I mean, and of course, this isn't always the way that it, or even college athletics can often be a really kind of problematically homophobic places, and and I don't want to discount that, but I do think there is a way, in certain places, and especially among people of a certain age, where some of these questions kind of get surpassed, pushed into the background, taken over, and I think Owen is a person who's able to do that. Yeah, and he's so attractive too. He's so confident in the way he approaches all the relationships and things that he really becomes a figure that Henry in a way looks up to, even though he doesn't identify with him as strongly as he does perhaps with Mike Schwartz. Mm-hmm. But
How did having a homosexual character allow you to explore some other of the relationships between the heterosexual men in the book? Because the relationship between Mike and Henry is really interesting. Perhaps you can tell us a little bit about Mike first, and then we'll look at the relationship between the two of them.
Yeah, well, I mean, the first two characters were Henry and Mike, and Mike is a year ahead of Henry in school. He's a couple years older. He's he's an orphaned guy from a very tough part of Chicago who has essentially sort of raised himself. He's really kind of an exemplar of the kind of self-made man in a way, and just sort of does everything through sort of sheer force of will, right? And so at the beginning of the book, they have a very intense sort of mentor-mentee relationship, which is, sort of vertical in a way, right? Because Mike just sort of tells Henry what to do,
right.
and Henry does it.
And he's so wise compared to Henry. He just seems to have the answers to everything.
Yeah, he knows a lot of stuff, that guy. And but also they're very close. And they're quite good friends. But from that relationship kind of intrigued me from the start, and also from the start, it became clear to me that what this book was mostly going to be about was going to be male friendships, right, and male relationships. Because I was going to be writing about a baseball team, and therefore was going to be an awful lot of men hanging around. But also I just kind of, I think in the back of my mind, I sort of felt like relationships between men in American culture, whether it's on television or in the movies or in books, is often sort of talked about in pretty reductive sort of ways. And we sort of have, you sort of have this sort of the dumb jock sort of stereotypes, and then you have the kind of the contemporary bromance, where women just sort of get in the way of the homosocial relations between dudes, and then eventually they grow up and get married and leave that behind, and it's all and it's all sort of very stupid and simplified. So of course there are many counterexamples, but I think I kind of wanted to make a counterexample, and I wanted to kind of write something that was really going to kind of give credence to the complexity of the relationships between men. So it started with those two, and then there's of course this other relationship in the book between where Owen develops this relationship with the president of the college, Gerd Affenlight, who is a heretofore avowedly heterosexual guy, and now is older. He's 60 years old, and finds himself drawn into what for him is this very strange sort of relationship. And that I sort of and Affenlight's character and Affenlight's infatuation with Owen kind of just sort of sprang up in the writing of the book, and I hadn't planned it out. But when it happened, it immediately felt quite right and natural to me. Because I did want to sort of represent this kind of spectrum of possible male friendships and relationships, and so to have what was ultimately going to become a sexual relationship seemed just right.
Right. But the relationships between them are all made so complex, because for instance, Henry and Mike fall out. They have this terrible rift between them. And in a heterosexual male-female relationship, you're dating somebody, you fall out, there's all kinds of codes and rules and things that go on around that, and you tell other people, and everybody knows, and you grieve, and all of the rest of it. But if two men fall out just as friends, that's much more complicated in a way, isn't it?
Yeah, I mean, it can be. It's yeah. I mean, it's complicated, and it's also. I mean, it's just a very different sort of thing, right? Because you don't sort of you don't sort of pledge yourself to the other person in the same sort of way. I mean, it might be just as kind of intense and complicated and important as a romantic relationship, but it also is this kind of weirdly uncontracted sort of thing. You know, and I mean, there's a moment kind of late in the book when Henry has kind of hit rock bottom, where he has this sort of reverie where he's like, where he's kind of thinking about how much he needs Schwartz, and yet there's no way to sort of express that. There's no way to sort of, I mean, you know, it's like it's not. It's not and will never be, and nobody wants it to be a sexual relationship, and yet they're so close and so dependent on one another that you want the same sort of security that would come with with a marriage vow or something, right? But you're not going to get that, and so it's I mean, it's interesting to me the way that we don't have the same language for these things that we have for romantic relationships.
So within that context, there's also the one singular female character in the novel, Pella, who is Professor Affenlight's daughter. And she almost becomes embroiled in a bit of a love triangle between Henry and Mike. What did that character... Well, firstly, female readers of the book, not all of them have been entirely satisfied with Pella, as I understand it from... Well, I really liked Pella, but I kind of wanted more for Pella. I wanted her to not be washing dishes in the college campus, and I wanted her not to be stuck between these two guys that were just neither of them, I don't think, any good for her.
Really?
Maybe that's just my response. But I felt that... I felt that her ambitions, when she'd started out as being, she was very smart, she went to college, but then she'd got sidelined, and she was depressed, and she got sidelined by a difficult relationship early on. But then she kind of almost ends up playing as a foil between Henry and Mike's relationship. How did she come to you as a character? Did you have her preconceived as how she would come in, or did she like the relationship between Gert and Owen just sort of pop up?
I don't know. I'm not sure. It was such. I mean, to me, Pella's a very. Pella's very important to me within the book for a couple of different reasons. Well, for one thing, because she is. I feel a lot of sympathy for her because I think for Henry and for Affenlight and also for Mike in some ways, they're these characters who have a very sort of clear goal in mind, and the goal is either being thwarted in some way or being achieved in some way. Affenlight just really is sort of desperate to get Owen, and and Henry is desperate for his baseball career to succeed. Mike was at a point desperate to get into law school, and now is having to deal with the fallout of that. In some ways, it's very. It's very easy to write a character in a book who wants something,
right?
Right? That's sort of if you took like a writing course, that's the thing they would teach you on the first day. It would be like, give your character some sort of desire that the reader can like sort of track. But I think that's only represents a certain number of people at a certain point in time. And I know. For myself, there have been times in my life when I have had some sort of clear goal in mind that I was pursuing, and my life became this sort of drama of pursuit and being thwarted and success and setback. But there are probably many more times in my life when I'm just sort of maundering around, not doing much, and just sort of wishing that I was, embroiled in that sort of drama. And so, I think Pella is a character who is at that point in her life when, she's at a pretty low point, and she's just sort of trying to figure out what it is that she might be able to want. It's this sort of like desire for desire, and she has to sort of rebuild her life in very, very sort of slow, painstaking sort of ways, and I've been there many times, you know, and I've you know, so you're just, and so when she you know, when she starts you know, washing dishes in the dining hall, but it's this, and of course that's not where she's going to be in 6 months or a year or you know, but it's this but it's this little bit of but she derives some little bit of satisfaction from this that kind of gives her something to kind of latch onto in her life and sort of build from.
Yeah, it's a very realistic portrayal, I think, of that kind of clawing your way back to some sort of sense of normality. Yeah, there's few women in the novel, though, because both Mike's mother has died, Henry's mum, she's on the end of the phone, but we don't really interact with her that much, and Pella's own mother isn't in the story either. Was it to be able to create such a male-centric world, was it important to kind of remove some of the female characters that may have influenced the existing characters' lives, or was that just the natural shape of the story?
Yeah, I mean, it's in some ways I think it was just a kind of function of wanting to kind of keep the set of characters as limited as possible, and you know, and because you know, because of the nature of the book, I had to have all these baseball players involved. Yeah, right. You know, I mean, so there are actually very few characters like outside of that world that really, you know, have much currency. I mean, none of the, you know, Owen's mom shows up at a certain point. But otherwise, you know, their parents, their family, you know, and Henry's sister shows up at a certain point. But their families, by and large, aren't very important to this book because it's sort of either because they don't have them or because the story is more about the way that you sort of leave home and then recreate yourself. You know, and so there are a couple other, you know, there's the chef in the dining hall who's male, there's the English professor who's female, but in a way I was just sort of limited by the fact that I had to have all these baseball players in the book, and those all had to be men.
But so back to the baseball, the kind of major, and I don't want to give too much away because there will be people in the audience who haven't read it. But the major sort of dramatic crux for Henry is the case of the yips that he gets, right? Mm-hmm. So could tell us what that is?
Yeah, and well, Henry is he's a beautiful, graceful shortstop who just plays effortlessly and never makes a mistake. And then one day he makes one errant throw, and thereafter things just sort of crumble for him, and he just sort of ceases to be able to throw the ball. You know, for no physical reason. He just sort of he makes one mistake, and the sort of doubt creeps in and begins to mount, and so he finds himself paralyzed, and that you know, and this plunges him into a sort of crisis, which you know, ultimately like really sort of changes his life and his whole way of thinking. I mean, in a way, that crisis was the starting point of the book. I mean, that was the first thing that I wanted to write about, because I had seen this as a baseball fan. Right. I'd seen this happen to some very excellent professional baseball players, and it was such a sort of gripping and terrifying thing to see, where these. I mean, I was at a game in Milwaukee, near where I'm from, and there was this great pitcher from the Atlanta Braves who had been one of the best players in the league, and he developed the yips, and so he had been struggling with this for a month or two, and so such that like his team would only bring him into the game when the game was really already decided one way or the other. So they were trying to bring him in when there was sort of no pressure on him. So they brought him into this game, and he's just throwing the ball like really just all over the stadium, and he was in this visiting park with this with what should be a sort of hostile crowd, but instead of cheering this, everyone was just sort of, it was like a sort of funereal sort of silence, because it really is, because you were really watching someone kind of face their demons in what is obviously like a very intense and private and emotional way, except you were sitting there watching it.
Right.
And so I was really drawn to the idea that you could write a really good piece of fiction about this. Because on the one hand, it's so dramatic the way that it happens, and on the other hand, it's so analogous to what people go through in much more private ways all the time. And for me, this felt a lot like what I was going through trying to become a writer. And for me, I was going through it just sitting in my bedroom at my desk every day. But you're just kind of constantly facing down this, this kind of paradox. I want so badly to be good at this thing. I'm desperate to be good at it. It's possible that I might be good at it, but you're just like kind of at every moment, at every sentence that you write, you're just sort of racked by doubts about it.
Was that your experience then? I mean, I know that it took 10 years to write, so that's a long journey. But did you experience that sort of crisis of confidence that the characters
Yeah,
do?
and I think I experienced it the most at the outset. I think when I started the book, I was in my early 20s basically, and I had this. I really wanted to be a writer. But I was not yet a very good writer, and it wasn't clear that I would ever, become so. So I didn't have a terrific amount of confidence about it. So I had some sort of weird thing that like kept me sitting there, which I guess could be described as some sort of confidence. But I was. I just also just sort of didn't quite yet believe from one moment to the next that I could actually do it, or the things that I was writing, weren't living up to this impossible standard that I'd set for myself,
right?
And I could tell that they weren't.
Did you have very high expectations for yourself? Because I know during that time you must have been doing your MFA and you would have been surrounded by a lot of other writers. And how much of a pressure was that?
Well, this was even before. I mean, I started the book actually before I started my MFA.
Okay.
So I'm even thinking of the time, before that. I think it's. The MFA was one experience, but I think that in general, it's more that you've just always like so valued this thing, right? And you put such stock in the books that you love, and the sort of feelings that those books give you, and so the desire is to be able to sort of replicate that, but you've sort of made it into such a sort of lofty thing that it's almost as if there's this weird. It's like, well, if I could do it, then it wouldn't be nearly as lofty as I think it is, because I'm just me, and so that becomes a sort of terrifying thought. That bounces back and forth in your mind.
And yet, this novel, since it was being pitched by your agent to publishers, it's had the tag of Great American Novel with it since the very beginning, and the reviews and the sales and the advance and all of that the whole journey is textbook, So how surprised were you by that, or did you feel by that point that you'd earned it, and what was that journey like for you?
Well, it was I don't know. It was a strange journey because when I first started showing the book to anyone, I was close to 9.5, 10 years in, and so that was one stretch of the process, and then finally it came time to send the book around to agents, and I was, and as has been documented, I was turned down by all but one of the agents that I sent the book to. And the agent who did like the book, a very wonderful young man, and I'm so glad that we wound up together. But like the fact of being turned down by all these other people, the whole time I was working on the book, I never felt that this book was going to necessarily be really like widely read, or was going to have, some kind of commercial appeal. Because for one thing, I just kept thinking, well, I'm writing a book about baseball, which is going to appeal to a certain group of people, but then it has all this gay stuff in it. And so like the two groups of people who might read the book have just like canceled each other out. And I'm just a bad businessman, But then, and this feeling was, kind of, was kind of reaffirmed when I was turned down by all these agents. But then my agent Chris and I sent the book around, and the publishing houses reacted very differently, and almost every house that we sent it to wanted to buy it, and so it turned into this competitive situation, and I got this very nice advance. And then after that, I went to edit the book, and I spent about 5-6 months, editing the book really intensively, like 12, 14 hours a day, and that was kind of incredibly, really sort of joyful experience for me. Because it was the point at which I got to really feel like a writer, because I knew that after I did this work, someone was actually going to publish this book, and so this was my job to sit down and do this. And even more than that, I really actually felt like I was finishing the book, like I was, because the hard part about working on something for 10 years or however many years is that you don't get the satisfaction of completion ever. You're just always kind of trapped in suspension. And you might have a good day, you might have a couple good days, but you're nowhere near any kind of sense of accomplishment.
Right.
Whereas in those last few months, I was repeatedly saying to myself, that chapter is done, I nailed it, and like that chapter is done, and that becomes you're like, that feels great. So I think when I really turned the book in for the last time, I kind of just felt like I had taken it as far as I possibly could.
Right.
And that no matter what happened, I was happy with it, and I was never going to have to work on it again.
Yeah. And do you think that sense of that joyfulness about nearing the end and the completion and the feeling of, did that influence the way that you edited the book and the way that you kind of put the finishing touches to the story?
How do you mean?
Well, if you had sort of never known that, if you'd really finished it without knowing whether publication was coming, perhaps you would have been more pessimistic about it, and you would have influenced the characters' decisions and the way they did things in that particular way. But I love the lightness of touch and the sense of fun and the humor and all of that about the story as much as I love all the complexity of it all. And I wondered, did any of that come in later because you were feeling a lot better about it?
No, I don't think so. I think that was kind of my approach to this world from the start. I just really, for one thing, I just really, value books that have a sense of humor about them, and they're just sort of always my favorite. And I think that, I think that the kind of comedy of life and the sadness of life kind of really go hand in hand. And and when I'm reading, it's hard for me to be really sort of deeply affected by a book unless it does have a sense of humor about it.
Right.
Because it's kind of because what's sort of really sad about life is the moments when when that sense of humor disappears, when it's impossible to have. I think that was kind of part of part of the project from the beginning. So I didn't write like a mean, dark book, and then after somebody wrote me a check, I was like, stop all that. Right. We're going to cheer it up.
All right. Well, I think it's time to take a few questions from the audience. There's ushers down here on the left and on the right, so if you put your hand up, they will bring the mics to you.
I've got a question about Mike Schwartz and Henry. And Mike Schwartz, as you said, is a self-made man. He's a very determined young man. And it was interesting to me the amount of time and energy he put into Henry and trying to mentor Henry. What do you think a person such as Mike gets from being a mentor?
Yeah, well, I mean, I think... Well, I mean, he kind of says it, in the very first chapter of the book. That Mike. I think Mike is a person who has always he's always craved sort of specialness. He's always sort of craved to be a sort of genius, for lack of a better word, and he's always kind of felt as if he didn't actually possess a particular genius of his own. And so when he sees Henry for the first time on that ball field in Peoria, he kind of gets this feeling that this is the thing that I've been looking for, and he's just kind of immensely attracted to it, and he recognizes that this kid needs him, and I think in a lot of ways Mike is sort of locked into that relationship from that very first moment, to say that this is sort of this genius that this kid possesses is one of the things that I sort of value most highly in the world, but he needs me to bring it out of him, and without me, it's not going to happen. And I think that's and I think and in the long run, I think that what Mike doesn't understand is that actually that is his genius, is the way that he nurtures other people, and the way that he is able to bring things out of other people that they don't know that they possess.
There's one right out the back there. Thanks. It's better be good.
Thank you. Oh, no pressure. I was going to ask about that moment you said when you're sitting at the desk and your confidence is really low, something keeps you there, and you said, oh, maybe that thing is just some residual confidence or something. But I wondered if you could tell us whether you think it's faith that keeps you there, that you'll eventually punch through the other side soon, or whether it's more like a discipline where you keep going, and regardless of whether or not you're going to succeed. 'Cause I'm interested in that, whether or not the idea that you'll succeed one day is the motivation, or whether you just keep going and then that is why you succeed.
Yeah, well, boy, it's a good question. I mean, when I think back on the kind of period of my life when I was starting the book, I mean, in a way, I want to sort of be. In a way, I feel like it was fear that kept me there, because if I hadn't stayed there at my desk, I would have had to go do something else with my life, and that would have I would have had to interact with people, I would have had to done an interview, and that would have been truly mortifying. So, but in a way, I think that's part of it. I think it was, I don't know. I mean, it was. There's certainly. I don't know if it's. I guess it's faith. I certainly never knew that I would, succeed in. Well, let me say this. I think what ultimately kept me at my desk all those years were the moments when I felt like I had succeeded. And I think that you try and you try and you try, and you spend hours just sort of banging your head against the wall, and then you spend weeks and months banging your head against the wall, and you have a moment or a sentence or an hour or a page where you're like, damn, I got it right there. And then it's gone again. but you're sort of desperate to get that sensation back. And I think that because looking back, I never had any sort of idea of what success would mean, or I didn't have any sort of particular ambition in mind. I think I was just always trying to sort of recapture those moments when it felt really good to be doing the thing itself.
I think we have time for one more. We're running a little bit late. One here. Oh, we'll take one there, and then another one just quickly behind you, and then we'll do.
Hello. Last question. Why does it take 10 years to write a book? What's the last thing? Is it one big thing that you couldn't figure out, or were you tweaking?
Yeah, well, you're right on, man. I mean, there's a lot. I mean, there are very dull practical reasons why it took me so long. I mean, I always had a full-time job, and some friends of mine and I started a magazine in New York called N+1 in 2004. So then I had 2 full-time jobs. So there were, so all that stuff sort of intervened. But I think from the very outset, I mean, like as I said before, and I really meant it. Like when I started writing this book, I was a pretty bad writer. I was a really sort of naive and inexperienced fiction writer. I'd been trying for a few years to do it, but I just wasn't very good at it yet. And yet I had this idea for a book, and I really liked the idea. And I knew that it was going to be a pretty long book. It was going to be in some ways sort of ambitious because it was going to be told from several points of view, and that I was going to want to sort of interweave these points of view and these plot strands pretty nicely. So I think I knew from the outset that this wasn't going to be a 1 or 2 year project. That I was going to have to teach myself how to write this book as I was writing it. So I think that, and also I procrastinated a lot.
There's time for a really quick one just in the row behind you, the chap who had his hand up a second ago, and then we better wrap up.
Well, I'm just grabbing the microphone to say that I was going to ask the same question.
Well, Chad, that was really, really fascinating, and I am glad that you persevered for 10 years. It's a fabulous book. I don't know how many of you have read it already, but if you've not, I would highly recommend The Art of Building. I'd also recommend that you check out the website for N+1. I know there's a print edition too, but the website is fabulous, incredibly well-researched, interesting articles. So N+1. And The Art of Building. We'll be selling copies of the books out in the foyer now, but the signing won't be until after Jeanette Winterson's event. Once she concludes, both Chad and Jeanette will be signing out in the foyer. So you've just got enough time for a quick glass of wine before we come back for Jeanette. But before you go, please join me in giving Chad Harbach a big thank you.